From teachillinois.com, this is The Teacher's Classroom, the podcast that explores current issues and topics in education and how they relate to teaching and students. Here is your host, Matt Weld.
Hello and welcome to episode 27 of the Teacher's Classroom podcast. My name is Matthew Weld. Everybody calls me Matt, so if you're cussing at me or just telling me to shut up, just please use my name, Matt. And in today's episode, we're going to be doing something just a little bit different. Normally I have a guest on the show, and I interview them about their profession and their specialty and talk about how what they are studying applies to the classroom. But for this episode, what I've been doing is I've been playing around with the Anchor FM app and how it has the ability to record little bits, little segments of audio, and then you can slide over interludes and piece it together into one cohesive whole. And so what I've decided to do in this episode, I've taken my thinking little bits as learning comes to me and I want to talk through something, I just start talking to my phone. And I just imagine all of you out there listening to this episode, and hopefully you'll be able to have a thought or two sparked in your own mind as maybe something that you want to then follow up with. And so this episode is just me rambling on and sharing my thinking. Part of what I've talked about in this episode is making yourself vulnerable, and how vulnerability is what is one of the key factors, I think, in embracing change and being courageous. And so this is me being vulnerable, putting myself out there, taking a risk, and sharing my learning with the world. So, episode 27, Matt's Learning, Part 1. So last night before I went to bed, I watched that new Gillette ad that, tries to reconceptualize what it means to be a man. And it's not, the exterior appearance, but really what we're like on the inside, and how other people are watching, especially kids who look at us as men to be models on how they will act as men. And so I went to bed with that on my mind. And so I woke up, thinking about how you can conceptualize this and visualize this and diagram it out for students. And, well, let me back up a little bit. So, story time here. So my wife and I used to be really pretty fit at various times in our life, but we've let that slide. We both went into administration, exercise routines kind of went to hell. And so we decided that, my wife decided, and I was like, okay, I'll go. We decided to do yoga. And so we went to a yoga studio. One of her colleagues' spouses is an instructor there. And so we went, and I was like, okay, there's all this mindfulness. Yoga is supposed to be great in schools. We've been to 2 sessions, and long story short, I'm kind of liking it. And because it's all about mindful, it's all about personalization. You do what's best for you. A lot of times you're encouraged to keep your eyes closed, so you can't be, you're not always evaluating, using that visual to evaluate. Anyway, I'm getting on a tangent. But there's a mindfulness component to the yoga session, and one of my goals this year is to become more mindful, and so I appreciated that. And so I'm thinking, okay, if I were a teacher, if I were teaching this, because, as educators, don't we always do that? If I were teaching this, what would I do? If I were a yoga instructor and I had a class full of men, how would I start out a mindfulness intention at the beginning of a yoga session and open up the conversation to what it's like to be a man in today's society? And so I thought, okay, it's like this. We're humans, first of all. And one of the things that I've been really interested in recently is the whole idea of human universals and the idea that there are these characteristics that biologically make us human. There are certain chemical pathways and wirings in our brain that are uniquely human. And we need to pay attention to those and use those to our best advantage in education and just to realize our full self and our full potential. And so if you diagram it out, we're human. Okay, so you have a box. And then the first difference, if you're making a dichotomous key, like I used to do with my 7th graders, the first difference would be, are you male or female? And I know there's all kinds of gender conversation right now, but we're talking about, in this context, what it means to be a man in the whole conversation around this new Gillette ad. And so you're either a man or a woman. You're male or female. And then if you go and draw it out on paper, then whenever you want to interact with someone in another box, okay, because you have human, and then you put out one arrow to the left and you put female, and you put one arrow out to the right, and you put another box and you put male. And if you want to communicate with someone in another box, you have to follow the pathways that are already drawn, okay? I just can't go from being a male and hop across blank space to the box that says female. I have to follow the line back up to where it says human, and then I can communicate or interact with another box. So as a male, I need to first go back up to being a human and everything that comes with that, respect, curiosity, that kind of thing, self-worth, identity, integrity, honesty, everything that it means to be a good human, and then you can interact with another box, in this case, that being a female. So that's kind of what I've been thinking about this morning as I woke up and kind of putting all this together. Started reading a new book today. It's called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. How to make smarter decisions when you don't have all the facts. And I'm just a couple chapters in, but it's already changed my thinking about how we make decisions. And in the classroom, I know one of the biggest things when I started teaching, probably the biggest thing that surprised me about teaching my first year was how many decisions I had to make in the course of 5 minutes. And we think of decisions as either right or wrong, but she points out in this book that really it's not 100% right or 100% wrong. We make decisions based on the knowledge and the beliefs and the probability that we have in front of us. And sometimes it works in our favor and sometimes it doesn't. And just because something doesn't work in our favor doesn't necessarily mean it was wrong. It just wasn't, the end result wasn't what we wanted, or maybe it wasn't what we expected. And so we need to shift our thinking when it comes to right and wrong as, is something really wrong or is it just less right? When we make a decision in class to discipline a kid, we're taking their prior history, our current mood, the rest of the class into consideration. But there are so many other factors at play that we don't know about. And it's those unknown factors that can come into the end result, and so whether that was actually a successful decision or not a right decision or a wrong decision, but a successful or unsuccessful decision. So really great book. I'm already learning a lot, and I can't wait to see what more I'm going to learn by delving into this decision-making realm. This past weekend was Ed Camp St. Louis, and I walked away, as I always do, with so many little tidbits. But the first one that's just really been rattling around my brain, what came from the session on mindfulness. And the more I learn about mindfulness, the more I feel like this is something that should be instituted, like everybody should have their own practice for mindfulness. We're in a day and age where everything is so fractured and so dysregulated, and things come at us at 50 miles an hour, and we need to just step back and realize that we're not biologically capable or set up for that. We evolved when things were at a much slower pace, and our brains cognitively can only handle one thing at a time. You may think you're multitasking, but there really is no such thing as multitasking. Your brain is just constantly switching back and forth quicker and quicker between several different things, and that's just cognitive overload, and you get exhausted. But then when you put that on top of people who suffer from trauma, and they are not able to self-regulate because they are constantly in that fear mode, and so the balance between if you're comfortable, if you're not operating in fear, then you're operating from comfort. And so you're then able to go out and explore things that might then cause you discomfort. Whereas if you come from a place that's from fear, you're not able to explore and be curious and go out to places that might cause you discomfort. So, this whole idea of mindfulness in the classroom and setting aside times for self-regulation and re-regulation was very insightful to me. This one teacher was talking about how in his high school classroom, he would start class by having kids put both feet on the floor, hands on their knees, and everyone breathes together. He counts. Everyone sets an intention for the day, kind of like the beginning of a yoga session, and then they start class. And, everyone just has that quick pause. It's like a minute long, and everyone kind of focuses and regulates back to where they want to be for that class. He then experimented and started one of his class periods where he gave the kids the first couple minutes to catch up on their social media, be on their phones, and then he started class. He had them write down their pulse rate and did the same request of asking for their pulse rate and recording it after one of his re-regulation sessions. And the students were then able to see just how much being on their devices elevates their stress response. The dopamine that they get, and they get texts, and they're trying to fit in. And, we can talk about that whole fitting in and belonging thing. But, it's crazy. So this whole idea of re-regulation and offering those times, even for adults, to have times throughout the day where you just stop, collect your thoughts, refocus, can have huge impacts on student learning. So I'm leaving a conference, and it's an ed tech conference, but I always, with cognitive psychology and marketing and all that stuff being side interests of mine, I tend to not necessarily focus on the ed tech tools so much as the big conversations around teaching, around education, around learning. And it seems like this year, after having been to Ed Camp St. Louis this weekend and this conference just now, that it seems like a lot of conversations are finally focusing around the learning that's going on. Maybe that's just a shift in my perspective, but not so much on the teaching, but the fact that we need to pay attention to the learning that's going on and then shift our teaching to that. I had an interesting conversation with a friend of mine I met at camp years ago, and we were catching up. Our careers have taken different, we have different positions now than we did when we first met each other. And it was interesting because he was talking about how he was like a teacher and then a ed tech coach at a public school. Then he moved as a tech director to a private school. And now he's working for a consulting business, but his kids are homeschooled. So he has this unique perspective on seeing public, private, and then homeschooling. And he was commenting that learning happens everywhere. And it's probably not as prescriptive as we think it is. And so you take that with the personalized professional development conversation that I had a couple of days ago with some people that I've known for a while, and how we wish that those of us that are motivated and always on the go to learn something new and to understand what's really going on with teaching and with students, that we could somehow be recognized for that. And then in some of my sessions where I ask teachers, when we're talking about branding, I ask teachers, so you're a stakeholder in this school. What do you want? What are your needs when it comes to your job? And it never, no one ever says, I want a raise. No one ever says anything about class size. They always say things like, I want to be recognized. I want to be appreciated. I want to know that I am actually making a difference. And so you kind of put all that together and you wonder, are we making too much out of this whole system of education? Should we just kind of relax and say learning takes place? We need to be more socially, emotionally aware for kids. Maybe, if we focus more on that and less on the academics, that our natural humanistic quality of curiosity will grab hold and be better rooted. Maybe that will close the gaps. Maybe that will help, foster a lifelong curiosity. So, just kind of reflecting on these things and trying to piece all these puzzle pieces together into the final picture. And it's interesting to see where all this will go. Something that I've been thinking a lot about in the last year or so is the topic of vulnerability, and how, especially as a male in today's American society, that vulnerability is something that just isn't expected. It isn't cherished. And in males especially, but I also see it in my role of trainers of teachers when I go in and talk to teachers, and I'm the one that's bringing around change and new things. And it's the people who are allowing themselves to be vulnerable that really find the most growth. And so the whole idea of vulnerability has really captured my imagination and my thought a lot recently. It all started when I read Brave in the Wilderness by Brené Brown. And she was the first one that talked about vulnerability. And I remember I was driving in my car and listening to the podcast On Being with Krista Tippett. And she was interviewing Brené Brown, who is a PhD social worker. She did her research on shame and belonging. And of course, vulnerability fits in beautifully with all those kind of things. And the one thing she said that made me stop my car, and literally this is a true story, stop my car, made a U-turn and went to Barnes and Noble and bought this book because I was just blown away. And that's the first time in my life I've ever done that kind of thing. Not generally a spontaneous person, but that's a whole nother story. But I just want to read this one section out of her book. It says that in all my research's 200,000 plus pieces of data, I can't find a single example of courage that didn't require vulnerability. Can you? In your life? Can you think of one moment of courage that didn't require risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure? I know the answer is no. I've asked too many people who say this, including special operations soldiers. No vulnerability, no courage. In the interview, she went on to say that, and this is what really struck me, is that we encourage courage, especially in men, right? You always want to be brave. You want to be courageous. You want to be that special operations soldier who does courageous acts. And yet, it's even those soldiers who say that you can't be courageous until there's a risk of emotional exposure. And that's exactly what vulnerability is. You can't be courageous until you're first vulnerable, because being courageous is the way you react to being vulnerable. And I see it so much with the growth mindset. Those people who are able and willing to make themselves vulnerable, they are the ones who then find that growth. They're the ones who find the courage to move forward and accept change. And so I just think that as a school / education / societal system, we need to find a way to encourage vulnerability, especially in our young men. Mothering and caring and being empathetic, that's more of a female virtue traditionally. And I think that as men in today's society, we need to make sure that we model vulnerability and show that it is a precursor to courage, and that the only way that we're really going to be able to move forward and restart some of these conversations that we've lost is to make ourselves vulnerable to the courage to make change. This is the final week heading into the Illinois Computing Educators 2019 conference next week. And I'm giving 4 presentations, one of which is an Ignite speech, which I'm excited to give. I've always been intrigued by them, not only by TED Talks, by Ignite Talks, but what an Ignite session is, it's just you have 5 minutes to give your spiel. And you have exactly 5 minutes because you have to provide 20 slides in advance. And those slides are set to advance every 15 seconds. So you have 5 minutes to get your point across. And creating that Ignite session has actually took more work than, say, a half-day workshop putting that together, because where do you start? Do you start with the pictures and fill in with the text, or do you start with the text and fill in with the pictures? And I found it easier actually to start with the text, because that's what you have the time constraint on, is what you're saying. And then you can divide it up into 20ths, basically, and create a graphic for each one of those. So that's what I did. And it took a while. You create an outline, you draw out your thinking, you outline, you sketch, you draft one, you record yourself, see how long it takes. You pare it way down. It turns out that it's like 2.5 pages double spaced. Well, if you're giving an idea in 2.5 pages, that's really not a lot. I mean, I remember as a student, you'd be assigned a 3-page paper and you'd be like, oh my God, that's going to take forever. But really, it's nothing. I mean, you can pound that sucker out in no time. So anyway, putting together an Ignite speech has been a rewarding experience. We'll see how the presentation actually goes. But my Ignite speech is on multipotentialites and how they really do exist in schools, and they need to be recognized, they need to be identified, they need to be nurtured, and they need to be celebrated in schools, both as teachers and as students, and then also as leaders. And so that's the whole premise behind it. Multipotentialites, I stumbled across it on Emily Wapnick's website, the Putty Tribe. She did a TED Talk on it. It's actually on the big TED stage, so it's a legit TED Talk. It's worth listening to. But what she says is, and that, she didn't come up with this. There are it's a psychological thing. Is that there are people out there, and I self-identify as one of them, who have all kinds of interests. Oftentimes one of their interests is something in the creative realm. And so they don't like to specialize. Like that's inhibiting to them when they're asked to specialize. And so, that question you're asked when you're a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? Well, I have no idea. What do you want to major in college? I have no idea. So me, I went to a liberal arts college, which was perfect because I took philosophy and art and science and English and a little bit of everything. And that was perfect for me. I ended up majoring in science, in biology, and the equivalent of a minor in English literature. So that, and then I did a lot of work in art and studio art. And I think it's followed me in my career. I bounce from one position to another. And I always thought that was a problem with me personally, that I couldn't focus and stay interested, that I couldn't, there was always something more to do. There was always another goal to achieve, or something else worth studying and pursuing. And, we have 50 million tabs open across our browser, and because one thing leads to another, to another, to another. And that can be a bad thing. But I think the strength in people such as us is that we are interested in so many things, that we have a generalist knowledge in so many things, that we are able to quickly adapt to new things as they come along, because we can empathize. We can easily switch our skills between many things. And so when a bump in the road happens, we have a whole skill set. We have a whole toolbox of skills that we can draw upon. And I think, when you have the world changing as fast as it is right now, and it's only going to get faster, that people like us who have multiple skill sets are going to be valued even more, especially in big systems where new positions are created and you need to find someone who has, skills in a whole bunch of areas to become this director of innovation or whatever is new. But then you want someone with experience. And since it's a new position, there's obviously no one with experience in that one skill set. And so you're going to have to find someone with experience in a whole bunch of similar skills. And that person is going to be a multipod, or that multipotentialite. So it's cool to finally be able to put a name to it. I've never felt totally lost or anything, but even in my art, when you jury into an art show, you go to, in the summertime, you go to those fancy art shows, and the people with the booths, you have to jury in, which means you have to send in photographs of your art, and you have to say what kind of media is going to be in your booth. Well, you'll notice that each one of those booths, and this is by the rules of the art shows, is that 90% of your art has to be one medium. Okay, so if you are jurying in as a pastel painter, for example, which is what I did, I wasn't allowed to show my watercolors or my oils or my ink or my calligraphy or anything like that. And so I had to actually spend a lot of time specializing in pastel. And I found that very constraining because I wanted to explore the same topic in a bunch of different media. And so I was always wondering, why can't we just have an art show where people just show up with all the stuff they've made? Because I know there are more people like me out there that just have random stuff, and when they feel like going to make something, they just go make something. So anyway, my Ignite session at ICE 19 is on multipotentialites. It's definitely a topic I'm going to explore some more in the near future. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for listening to my ramblings. This has been the new Matt's Thinking episode on the Teacher's Classroom podcast, which is it's been brought to you by the Regional Offices of Education down here in Illinois Area 5. The Teacher's Classroom lives at teachillinois.com, which is an online professional development platform. I can be found on Twitter at Matthew Weld, and Teach Illinois can be followed at TeachILPD. This has been brought to you by the Regional Offices of Education Innovation Initiative. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to meeting you here again, right here on the Teacher's Classroom.